Let's see how a MacBook Air M4 would do in a pro photo and video workflow. I'm ArtIsRight. As usual, I'll be sharing lots of information. Please pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. Timestamp will be in the description, although it may not be available right when this video launches. One thing that all of you can do to help me out is to tap on that like button. This way, YouTube algorithm will push this to an even larger audience. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so and help me grow the channel. Now, this channel is fully self-funded. If you find information that I'm sharing with you helpful, please consider supporting this channel by using the YouTube Super Thanks. I'll also leave a link to my tip jar in the description. You can also join the channel membership. And one thing that you can definitely do to help me out is if you can share this video with at least 3 other people who are looking for similar information. I would greatly appreciate that. This way we will get more view and grow the channel even further. And if the only thing that you can do is liking and subscribing to my channel, I appreciate that as well. Lastly, this is a one-person channel. One person run, so please remember to be kind in the comments. If I make any mistake, let me know. I will correct them in the next video. Now for this, we're going to be taking a look at the MacBook Air 13-inch, and we're going to take the M4 generation. Now for this, I'm not looking at the 15 generation. In the past, I've done some comparison testing the 13 and the 15 one. Because they're all passive cooling, they're performing pretty much just on par with each other. Here's the rest of the breakdown. Now, they all come with 16 gigabytes of memory now. Yay, that's really good. And also, all the machines are now like $100 cheaper compared to the previous generation, something that's really great to see. You're also going to see the result of this compared to the MacBook Air going back to the M1 generation. And you're also going to see all of the MacBook Pros, M1, M2, M3, M4, and also the MacBook Pros for the Pro and the Max Silicon from the M1 Max to the M4 Max, and also the M1 Pro to the M4 Pro. I'll also add in some of the desktop machine too, and you will also see some other desktop machine as appropriate when we're doing the big compilational chart. Lastly, here's a test PC that I have, and you're going to see the result in there too. So I will have a configuration and buyer guide towards the end that will pretty much guide you to the decision based on the app that you're doing. Now, when it comes to Apple Silicon, one thing that I always say is that there are two segmentation. There's more the consumer leaning and pro oriented. Here's the thing. If you are a pro, if you work for revenue, if you're getting paid for your creative work, especially for photo and video, definitely don't consider these consumer leaning. Just at least get a pro, because you're going to get, especially if you're looking at these laptops, you're going to get an active cooling, meaning that there's going to be a fan on the system. And in general, it's going to cost not that much more from, like, you know, the base machine here that we're going to talk about, but you're going to get that much more benefit in terms of like the cooling itself. It's going to be faster and you're going to be much more productive that way. So that's just something that I recommend. And even though you may not want to go to like the max in the laptop, you can still go for a pro and get a pretty good machine. Now, I want to be really firm on this, saying that if you are a creative pro and you're getting paid, a MacBook Air should not be your primary machine. This should not be your go-to machine every single time as a creative pro. Now, if you have, for example, a Mac Mini M4 Pro or a Mac Studio at your home, at your office, whatever that may be, and this is going to be on your road machine or on the road machine, why not? I mean, this works really great. However, if it's going to be your primary one, this is going to slow down quite a bit, and it goes through a lot of thermal throttling on these because there's no way to actively cool the silicon on the system. It's only passive cooling. So just remember that as we're going through all of these. All right, so upgrade priority. This is what I recommend you do if you want to get the most performance per dollar spent on these machines. Start out with the memory. Now, the amount of memory you choose are going to a lot of time dictate the chip family that you have to go into, whether it's the regular going to the Pro or the Pro going to the Max, for instance. Although the memory this time around, they do have quite a range now compared to the previous generation silicon, which is a good thing. Then consider upgrading SSD, and lastly, chip variants. Even though these M4, beyond just like the 13-inch base model for like the entry model for the MacBook Air, there's not really a way for you to choose a different chip variant, so you don't really have to worry about that much. And sadly, when it comes to these MacBook Air, they're not considered pro machines, so they don't have a pro display in there. That's why there's no reference mode, nor are there any nano textures, so it doesn't really work for Air on that one. Although I did run the calibration for both hardware and software. Software running on the device itself, it did pass without any problem. I ran a hardware and also software calibration on the external display. We are pretty much good to go there. So here's something that I always say. If you're a creative pro, recommend setting up as a new machine. If you're coming from Intel, definitely recommend setting this up as a new machine for general use. It's going to do you wonders. Now, here's how you read the spec. One thing that I do want to note is that on the regular silicon M1, M2, M3, M4, and also on the Air, you're also going to see a lot of this, like the 2x one. 2x meaning that I'm using the double timing method, meaning rather than testing 1,000 files, I'm only testing 500, and I'm doubling the amount of time that it takes. I've run a lot of tests on this already to compare the time between running a full session versus running half, and doubling the time works out fairly well, and they are within a margin of error because they're so slow. I have to spend an hour for every single test. I mean, there's no way I can really finish all these tests. All right, SSD. Remember that you can always expand this. You have ports on the side. You can plug in external SSDs, hard drive, NAS, and so forth. You can always expand this. So choose the size that you want. Don't worry too much about the speed, but here are the speed if you really want to consider this. Oh, the other thing that I do want to mention on these two is that on the M4 generation MacBook Air now, you can now output that to 2 displays at once and also have the internal display also showing at the same time. So something new there, and you also have an upgraded webcam. Just want to insert those in there in case those of you that are wondering. Now here's the speed for the rest of the other computer, and I've also made a video talking about how fast of an SSD you really need. To leave a link to this in the description. The answer is that you don't need to get the Thunderbolt 5 to get the most workflow and most productivity, because you're not really going to realize that performance. Our apps right now can't really use that kind of speed. Now when it comes to the memory, the RAM in the system, or I would just call it RAM. Anyway, you're going to need more of those, right? So think about this really carefully, because you cannot go in and upgrade this. It's a good thing that Apple is now starting this at a baseline 16, but if you need more, you're going to need more. For instance, if this is your secondary machine you want to take on the road, I might bump it to 24, like 32 or something like that, just to give yourself a little bit more room so you can work on those files a little bit easier. The best way for you to really figure out if the RAM that you have is working for you or not, especially if you're on a Mac, restart your system, launch Activity Monitor, go into memory, and I would tile your windows in a way that you can see the memory pressure all the time and start going through your workflow as you would normally do. If you're in the green, you're pretty much good. If you're in yellow or red, probably think about upgrading. Personally, I use an app called iStat Menu 7. I'm not sponsored by them, but I've been using them for years, actually probably decades now at this point. I really like their app, and it actually keeps a good track of that. Like I said, we have 16 gigabytes of memory at the minimum now, finally, so that's a good thing. But if you're Creative Pro, I probably would still think about upgrading. So I've tested the results on all these different computers. They are pretty much coming out just about the same, so we're pretty much good to go there. So some of the results you're going to see are tested on 15.0.1, 15.1 with the different app versions and so forth. I've actually pulled a few machines to run some random testing, and we're pretty much good to go. Lastly, I also will say that there's like a slowdown trend over time too. So especially if you have these regular silicons, the slowdown are going to be much more noticeable over time. And you're going to see that, for example, on the M1 generation, it's going to take forever now. Whereas, for example, you have like the Pro or the Max, the effect of that is actually less noticeable. All right. Like I mentioned before, I use the 2x testing method on many of these machines, so you're going to see the 2x notation at the end there. Let's take a look at Lightroom Classic 1-to-1 preview for 1000 Sony a7R5. Well, it's really more like 500, but in order for me to compare it to the other machine in the lineup, which I did do the full 1000 test, we're doubling the timing for these. So you can see these are about the timing where we would expect them to be. MacBook Air M4, it's pulling up just a little bit ahead of, for instance, of like the MacBook Air M3. So this is not doing that well when it comes to this one. And when I take a look at these numbers, I'm a little bit surprised that we're not seeing a bigger gap, but there are some other tests that I've done that we're going to see bigger gaps. Now, I do want to point out, by putting in, for example, the MacBook Pro M4, MacBook Pro M3, and you can see that with active cooling, it actually does wonder for the system, right? It brings the time down by quite a bit because there is now a fan dissipating the heat. So that means even though it's thermal throttle, there is a way for it to dissipate heat so that it can run at the higher speed again. So these are just things to think about when it comes to this. And even, for example, the MacBook Pro M2 is pulling up just, well, not really ahead. I mean, I really should be swapping these two, but they are within a margin of error. It's performing just about the same as the MacBook Air M4 there, even though the M4 is supposed to be performing a little bit better. Here's the rest of the machine in the lineup, and now let's take a look at Lightroom Classic export for these 1000 Sony files, and we can see that the M4 is pulling up ahead by just a little bit, and we can see these are like marginal generational gaps, right? This is something that we would have expected on the import too, even though we didn't see that. So something wonky is really happening, but that have also happened with every single generation machines that I've tested in the past. Like one of them would not perform properly, even though I ran the test multiple times, there's still the same result. Now, when we add in machine with active cooling, M3, M4, MacBook Pro, even the 13-inch MacBook Pro M1 is actually doing pretty well. And interestingly enough, the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2 is falling behind on this test. So, I mean, like I said, this is probably what would probably fall under like the wonky result there. But interestingly enough, MacBook Air M4 is actually right there. Not too bad, but if you go with an active cooling machine, just comparing, for example, M4 to M4, you're much better off with a laptop that had active cooling for these creative workflow. Now, if you're just doing word processing, you're just doing some light work here and there, you're a student and so forth, you're not really doing a lot of image processing this way, these are going to be fantastic machines. So the audience for this machine is much different. It's really not as a primary creative pro machine. I want to be clear on that. Lightroom Classic HDR merge. You can see how the timing, these are just based on the generations of the machine itself. You can see when I add in all the other machines, the M4 are grouping together, M3, M2, and also M1. You can see that kind of cluster happening there. And yeah, they are taking a little bit more time compared to the other machines. For example, if you take a look at a 16-inch MacBook Pro M4, it's 24 seconds versus like 20 seconds. I mean, it's not 27 seconds. It's not that big of a deal, but when we start to aggregate this in a pro workflow, it's going to start to make a lot of sense in the long run to just bump up that little extra to get you a little bit more of that active cooling. Lightroom Classic Panorama merge on this one. This machine doesn't have a lot of memory and a lot of weird results are happening. This is happening on every single generation of regular silicon. For example, M1 can't finish a task anymore, even though it has 16 gigabytes of memory. The M4 one is taking close to like over 4 minutes. I would say close to 5, not really quite, but over 4 minutes to finish the task, whereas the M3 is taking like a minute and a half. And by the way, these are, M2 has a little bit more memory and it's taking a little bit longer. So something is not working right on these regular silicon machine when it comes to the panorama merge. And when I throw in the other results here for this one, interestingly enough, some of these, I actually didn't even finish a task on some of these other machines, which is weird, wonky, strange, but nonetheless, it did happen. For example, 14 MacBook Pro M3 did finish, but it took 9 minutes. Something is really wrong with this. And if you're Adobe, if you're watching this, I would definitely look into fixing these for the regular silicons. So here are the other machines. And let's take a look at Lightroom Classic AI noise reduction. This is a task to run on the GPU. It's supposed to be running on NPU, but some issues. So it's now back to running on the GPU. And we can see that it has the same amount of cores there, 10, 10, 10 throughout, and we're only seeing like slight generational improvement. There's really not that much in terms of GPU improvement when it comes to these tasks throughout the time. And obviously the one with, and as you can see right now, this is clustering almost by generation, not quite. For example, M4 is at the top, M3 there, but these M2s are now coming together, and the MacBook Air M3, it's just slightly behind. They're only like about seconds behind each other. So I probably wouldn't worry about it much. Like I said, if you have to put these together or do something like this on the road every now and then, it's fine. But if you're constantly doing this day in and out, this is definitely not the machine for you. Now let's do the same AI noise reduction with 10 files and do this as a batch. We can start to see that there is some time gap, but not that big. M1 is really falling behind, but it doesn't have that many GPU cores, or 2 less, and it's also that much slower. But all these other ones are just clustering fairly close to each other. Now, just to give you some perspective, when we start to get active cooling, for example, in the 14 MacBook Pro M4 and M3, we start to see the time drop. In fact, the MacBook Pro, even the M2, is performing a little bit better than this, because when you start to really run these tasks and is pushing the silicon hard, right? Again, passive cooling, no way to cool it down. So having active cooling is definitely helping out in terms of performance. These are the rest of the computers. And now let's take a look at AI sky and subject masking. When we take a look at this, they're only like, just a few seconds apart. Not that big of a deal. This is pretty much spreading in the way how we expect it to by generations. And this is also following the generation really closely, because we're not really going and pushing the silicon long term. We're just looking at just the speed that you're pretty much using from the GPU core, the single GPU cores, or the few GPU cores in this case. So those are the things to note there. And now let's take a look at Lightroom. So this is exporting. Well, this is, again, like I said, instead of 1000, it's really 500. But in order for a compare, we're going to say this is 1000, or by doubling the time. So you can see this is where the timing comes out on all this. And interestingly enough, the M4 is pulling out a little bit ahead of the M2 and M3 generation. And Also, wonky enough, the M2 is coming slightly ahead of the M3. Like I said, there are a lot of weird anomalies, and some of these I actually did do some random testing when the result doesn't come out right like this, and it still repeats itself in kind of the same fashion. When we add in, for example, the 14-inch MacBook Pro M4, M3, even M2, it's performing that much better. You can see how the time gaps there is really starting to add up. So like I said, as a pro, I mean, these can be your on-the-road machine, but I also might recommend going for just the MacBook Pro instead, even if you are going to just go with the M4, because the timing there, we're talking about like 10-minute variation. That's starting to get into the significant territory a little bit. And even though, yeah, these are a lot of files, but you know, these are just some of the points that you might want to think about. And now let's take a look at Capture One. In the latest version, it goes in and utilizes GPU on export much more efficiently than the previous versions, and we're going to see how it does on these MacBook Airs. So first, let's start out with the import. CPU-based tasks, M4, M3, M2, M1, the way how it's really happening here is exactly what we would have expected. M4 is slightly faster than the M3 and M2, M1 following behind. Now, interestingly enough, when I ran this test and did a whole bunch of like random like testing and so forth, the timing for this version and the other version are within a margin of error of each other, even though this current version is a little bit faster than the previous one when it comes to like import. I'm still using the result from the previous one, which is also explains some of this wonkiness that's happening. For example, the MacBook Pro M3 is, you know, just a touch longer than the MacBook Air M4, and then we have the M1. That these are active cooling machines that are just pulling up ahead there. So just something to note, but you get an idea where these are falling. Here are the other machines in the lineup. And what we're going to do is show you the export. And when it comes to like the export, this is again what we would expect it. And only having 10 GPU cores is really dragging things along to like quite some time there, as you can see. In fact, for the MacBook Air M1, it takes a little bit over an hour, where this 43 minutes, 48 minutes, it makes sense, right? This is showing a good generational improvement, but nonetheless, it still takes a lot of time. And if, like I said, if you're a pro, I would definitely consider bumping this up. Now with this, I'm only going to show you the rest of the other machines. I haven't done the testing again on the regular machine, so I'm not going to share with you the result for that one. Now let's take a look at Photoshop. I'm using Lloyd Chamber, Digital Lloyd Test. Links to his resources will be in the description. And here are the 3 tests I'm doing, starting with Photoshop Speed. And if you take a look at this, they're just really just milliseconds apart, so maybe like 1-2 seconds apart at the very most, but this is happening exactly the way how we would have expected. Add in the machines with active cooling. These are grouping by generation, M4, M3, M2, and M1. Makes a lot of sense, right? So here's the rest of the machine. Now, before we talk about Photoshop Medium and Photoshop Huge, what I want to do is show you the SSD speed. Even though some of these are not that far further apart from each other, only like maybe 100 or 200 megabytes, there are certain ones that are a little bit slower, but this is going to somewhat explain the result that you're going to see in just a moment. So let's take a look at Photoshop Medium. Interestingly enough, the M2 with more memory in the system is doing a lot better. That is because this file is pretty much filling up the memory, but we still have extra room to compute. So if you're taking this on the road and you're going to work with a lot of large files, definitely get more memory in your system. M3 is coming up slightly ahead of M4 there. Like I said, the results are not quite as straightforward, and even though the SSD speed on M4 is actually mighty fast, we're still seeing results that are coming out strange this way. In M1, it's just falling behind there. A lot of this have to do with like just the CPU itself too, but you start to see the idea where these are all spreading apart there. So interestingly enough, having something with 24 gigabytes of memory is still doing well. M3, M4 there. The Air M3 is doing slightly better than the MacBook Pro M4. So some of these results, like I said, they're not like the full comprehensive result. I find that this generation, especially when I'm testing the regular silicons, there's a lot of strange anomaly that pops up, and I would describe this as one of the many that we have seen so far in this testing. So let's take a look at Photoshop Huge on this one. 56 gigabyte, this is filling up the memory like there's no end to it. And it also goes into what they call paging in Photoshop now, meaning that is writing to the SSD and reading. 24 gigabytes helping out a little bit, although the M1 is pulling up the head of like the M4 and also the M3. So remember the SSD speed we talked about before? I would use that as a reference, and also the CPU core. But I mean, the speeds there, you start to get an idea when it comes to these machines. They're not the most straightforward when it comes to like working with Photoshop. Now, we're also going to use this as kind of like a reference because, for instance, all the MacBook Pros are not performing that well, but this is also taking the result from like the previous test and not like the current one. I didn't rerun the test on this. So hopefully there's some improvement there, but you know, I've already said in the previous video too that these results are rather strange. Now, what I do have to make up for all those strange results is the Puget bench test, and we see how the M4 is faster than the M3 by a pretty decent margin, like about 1,000 points or so. And then M2 and M1, you start to see the idea how that is happening. Add in, for example, the MacBook Pro M4. These are more generational, but having the active fan on the system, for example, the Pro there, is actually doing a lot of good. Interestingly enough, the Air on the M2 compared to like the MacBook Pro M2 is actually pulling up ahead, but also that's because the Air have like 24 gigabytes of memory. Take that what you will. I would say that this number are pretty much within a margin of error of each other. You can see how they're actually fairly close to each other when you're talking about Air and regular using Puget bench test. So they target a little bit differently, but you can definitely read up on that too. Encoder decoder engine. So when it comes to this, having active cooling is going to help. And also, even though the M4 generation has an updated encoder decoder engine that's slightly faster, we're not really seeing that much benefit on the Air there, just because it still heats up and the computer needs to still do what they call a thermal throttling, meaning that it's capping the speed of the silicon for it not to burn out. So the rest you can kind of see there is slightly faster, but not by much. It really should be in that range, but it doesn't have the fan on the system. And you can see how everything just spreads out there. This is where having like the Ultra is nice because, you know, as you go in a higher chip silicon family, you start to like double those encoder decoder engine. Mind you that the regular and also the Pro silicon has the exact same amount. It's when you get to the Max where you double the Pro and the regular, and then when you get to the Ultra, you start to quadruple the Pro and the regular or double the Max. So just a little FYI there. Here's the spread for the export and HEVC, and we can see that the MacBook Pro M4 is there. And interestingly enough, the MacBook Air M4, it's just pulling up at like taking much longer on this one. Again, it could be like heat related issues that's causing that to happen. You start to see the result there. And ProRes 422. MacBook Pro M4, MacBook Air M4 is falling behind a little bit on that one. I believe that this generation processor probably runs at a higher frequency and also runs a little bit hotter too, which might be what happens when we don't have active cooling on them anymore. That's why it's taking a little bit more time. So that's the case there. After Effects using Adobe Benchmark. So for these M4, M3, M2, M1, yeah, it just makes a lot of sense, right? This is exactly what we would expect it, but it's not showing the same way throughout. This is part of the reason why I'm doing all these testing too, so we can see how the software is responding to the silicon, and that's important to see because not seeing that, I mean, we can't just assume that everything is going to just work out the same based on the current version and software and OS combination is on, you know, on the market right now that we can have access to. So this is grouping by generation M4, M3, M2 and M1 with the active one slightly faster. This is exactly how we would have expected to go, but this is a fairly straightforward task compared to other ones that we have also done too. Premiere Pro, this is using Puget Bench for this one, and M4, M3, M2, M1, even though this one, the increase is not quite that big at all when it comes to like video performance as far as like M4 and M3 generation. So if you have an M3 Air, you might be good there, but again, hopefully you're not using these Air for professional workflow as your primary machine. All right, here are the rest of the machine in the lineup, and we can see that the Pros, both M4 and M3 is pulling up ahead of the MacBook Air M4, MacBook Air M3, Pro M2, Air M2, and then Pro M1, Air M1. So there are some jump gaps there that you see, but they're, you know, they're not too far. They're apart from each other. All right, lastly, we're going to take a look at Resolve, Davinci Resolve, and M1 can no longer finish the test. I mean, I've already shared this result in the past too, that even just the MacBook Pro M1 just can't finish this result, but you start to see the spread in performance right there. You start to see that even, like I said, the MacBook Pro M1 can't finish this, but MacBook Pro M4 it's doing pretty well. MacBook Pro M3 is actually doing just ahead of the MacBook Air M4. So if you have a MacBook Pro M3, you're pretty much good to go relative to all the performance you're seeing right now. And we see the MacBook Pro M3 coming out ahead of the MacBook Pro M4, and that's because it has an active fan in the system that's cooling it down when it actually gets hot running all these tasks. The rest of the machine in the lineup, and what it really comes down to with Air is that now you know which machine, how it is performing and how is it going to work out for you. So you might be wondering which one to choose. First, what I would probably say is that if you're a creative pro and you're just trying to get something new, I would look into going with the 14-inch MacBook Pro, either with the M4 or like the M4 Pro. I think you're going to gain a lot of benefit from that, and maybe even jumping up a little bit higher to, for example, the M4 Max or the Max Silicon. This also gives you an idea too, if you go into like the previous generation. I don't know, when it comes to these regular silicon, I don't like to recommend that you go back and get, for example, the previous generation, because you're not really gonna expand or extend the life of the machine by that much. I would probably say, like, if you're thinking about getting a previous generation, look at my compilation chart and maybe going back to, for example, like the M3 Pro generation. I think that will probably be a better machine if you can find one at a good price on the market. The whole point is finding one either on the refurb site or on the used market at a pretty good price that makes a lot of sense compared to these new machines when you are looking at it. If you're an upgrader, when it comes to these machines, you gotta think about, like, if you want speed, then definitely upgrade the machine, upgrade the silicon that you have. If you want more SSD space, because on these laptops, they're pretty much just soldered in, so you can't really just add any more to it. I mean, there's a way to do micro soldering, but for the most part, we can't really do that. And when you do that, you void the warranty as well. Or you need to upgrade the RAM of the system, which is, there's really no way to upgrade that. It's just tied to the silicon. So those are just things to think about, depending on where you are, depending on the justification. Hard to say. Now, upgrade priority, as I say, bumping up memory. We saw that in Photoshop. From 16 to 24 gigabyte, it's actually doing much better. That's where you're going to get most performance per dollar. Then, like I said, go for like the chip family, because the chip family is going to tell you a lot what you can choose. But when we're talking about the Air, there's not a lot to really talk about in that regard. But this is where we say, go from a regular to, for example, like a Pro. It's going to do you wonders, especially if you are a creative pro. SSD and storage size would be the next thing that I would do, but I would probably say 256 is not enough. So I would definitely go for 512 at the very minimum. And lastly, chip variants. When you're on the more of like consumer oriented, there's not a lot of chip variants you can really choose from. In fact, I don't even have any regular in these charts, because like I said, if you are a creative pro, you're doing this, you should be going for at least with a Pro Silicon. And you can look based on the apps that you're using, what you want to do. Good, better, best, just reading that across. For example, Lightroom Classic, good would be the Pro. Better would be the Max, because they can now go in and utilize the GPU, but the best would be the Ultra, because you're going to get the ultimate performance there. That's something that happens. When it comes to Photoshop, it's not quite straightforward anymore. I mean, M4 Pro, M3 Max, M4 Max, it's going to give you the best performance when you go in and really bump up the memory, but having the Ultra really means nothing in that regard. But you can also see the result that I've shared with you too, that these regular machines compared to the Pro, they're not really doing that good. And if you don't want to spend a lot of time trying to finish these tasks, I mean, I would definitely consider upgrading. Now, where these machines can work fairly well would be, for instance, if you're just using it as a machine to download something, to upload something to like the cloud or to the AI for like editing, and you have another machine at home that will do like the final exporting in the end. I think that's something that is making a lot of sense, where you use it as an ingestion machine, something lighter you can take on the road with you. It makes a lot of sense for that. But if you're doing any type of semi-heavy work, if you're processing more than like 100 files to here, I don't think that really, the more files you do processing through this machine, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Caption 1, best would be M4 Max and the 2 Ultra, M2 Ultra, M3 Ultra, M1. I put it into like a better category. If you see the result, it will make a lot of sense. And then if you do video, I mean, obviously I would either go with like the Pro. I don't really like to recommend the Pro. That's why only one of them made it in there to that chart, which is M4. I would say go for like the Max, and even like the M1 might be a great consideration, because you can still get an M1 Max at a pretty good price now, right? Or just get the Ultra for the ultimate, again, performance, because it quadrupled the number of encoder decoder engine compared to the regular or the Pro Silicon. As far as the amount of RAM on the system go, 16 is definitely a great starter. However, if you are a Creative Pro and you need to use a little bit more than that, I would probably say bump it up to, I don't know, 24 or like 32 or something. I give yourself a little bit more, especially if you're going to keep your machine longer. As far as SSD, my minimum recommendation is 512. 256 is not enough. You're going to fill it up just with your apps alone without putting any much data on there, and to run everything off SSD all the time can be really annoying. So the limitation is going to hit you really fast with like 256. I recommend at least 512, if not 1 terabyte. So if you're upgrading your silicon, the best thing you can do, I would use this chart and I would just circle the one you're on right now and start looking at arrows. With this, it's not a bad idea, for example, if you go with the Ultra, if you're looking for like a desktop machine. But if you're just looking for like a laptop, M2 to like an M1 Max is not a bad deal either. So those are just some of the things to think about. I mean, if you have like an M4, I would probably say either go for like the M4 Pro, M4 Max, or even just the M3 Pro. It's going to do you a lot of wonders, or going, for example, like to the M3 Max. So those are just some of the things to think about. There's so many different pathways to like upgrading. There's so many machines on the market now. There's also like I said, Apple Refurb. There's also used machine on the market that can work out really well. And as long as you're not iCloud locked, you can just sign on and use it as your machine, and you save a lot of money that way. So lots of consideration there. But so this is the test result from the MacBook Air M4. Do I like it? I think so. I mean, I like it as a light machine. For example, I have one of these, or multiple of these now actually, but I usually carry the Air on site with me because when I need to do something really quick, something really light, checking emails or something that needs a little bit more power than an iPad, where I need to go in and like do full web browsing and so forth and need a little bit more dexterity, it works out really well for that. But that's something that I use for my workflow. Now, when I need to go on a trip for photography or something, I end up taking my Max machine with me. But that also is something that will apply to many of you too. I would think that you would get much more benefit from it, as I've shown with you, from going with a Pro machine, especially if you are creative. Now, if you're just someone starting out, if you're a student, if you're just using this for school, I think these are fantastic machines. Don't get me wrong. Nothing wrong with these machines at all. It's just picking the machine that is best suited for the workflow that you want to use it for. Anyway, I hope you find this helpful. If you have any questions or comment, please leave them for me. Please give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell to renew. I'm Art, and thank you for your time.